So tell me a little bit more about what you're trying to. So let's talk about the two separate activities that you're doing. So you're launched a campaign, like a large campaign to address the RTO demands, and then you're also launching a lawsuit. So I'd like to treat those kind of distinctly and help me understand a little bit more about what you're doing. So just so you probably know about me, so I'm a columnist for the Toronto Star. I'm also a
Mhm.
consultant on the return to the office. I'm an expert witness in lawsuits on this topic for remote work for public and private companies. So I know quite a bit about lawsuits and I know quite a bit about return to office, about these sorts of dynamics.
Right.
And I've written a number of these topics. So that's kind of my background.
Okay. Yeah. Where would you like me to start? The lawsuit or the campaign more
The
broadly?
campaign first.
Sure. The campaign is something that's I think had been brewing for a long time.
Mhm.
It's something that really kind of like came to a head kind of halfway through the ongoing pandemic, I guess. But when there was a kind of like demand for office workers to return back to the office, a lot of people were
Mhm.
questioning why we didn't have any kind of productivity studies or any kind of baseline data showing why the return to the office
Mhm.
was so necessary. And I think a lot of people were like, okay, the pandemic is easing, restrictions are easing at the very least, and it's time to quote unquote get back to normal. But then, as a lot of our members returned to the offices, well, first off, they found that the offices were in much worse shape than when they left them in,
Mhm.
just in the sense that a lot of offices had been downsized. The federal government has a longstanding commitment to convert a lot of federal real estate and especially kind of like underused office property into housing, which is a good thing. We support
That's a
that.
good thing.
But at the same time, we've talked about diminished office space for the people in office, and a lot of
Mhm.
the office kind of like arrangements, the general office layout had changed in the form of everybody now had gone to hoteling. So no assigned
Mhm.
workstations, no kind of like, no lockers in a lot of cases, no ability to leave your equipment in the same spot. So people were dragging around laptops and docks and things like that back and forth on especially in the national capital region on a really crisis-ridden transit system. So there's all
Mhm.
these kind of interconnecting factors that all of a sudden we're commuting again, all of a sudden, and all of a sudden we're commuting again, all of a sudden we're buying lunch again, but all of a sudden our workstation, like we had a desk before the office for a lot of us. Our members are policy analysts.
Mhm.
They're translators, and a lot of them work from whatever state of desk that they were at before, but at least it was their desk. So that was a really huge one for us, is that we're going into worse offices than the one we left behind during the pandemic after learning and
Mhm.
learning well that a lot of us can work extremely productively remotely. But also more than that, a lot of us had hired a lot of team members from around the country, pulling from a much deeper talent pool. And I can speak for my own team. I was on an
Mhm.
industrial strategy team in the automotive kind of branch of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada,
Mhm.
doing a lot of work on the electrification of transportation, that type of thing.
Mhm.
And we found that we were hiring some of the best, kind of like especially newer, younger students out of their programs who otherwise might not have moved to Ottawa, but because they were allowed to work from
Mhm.
anywhere in Canada and work effectively from there, we were really adding some really crisp resumes to our team, and those people are still working remotely for their teams because people realize because a lot of the management in my branch, at least, and I'm sure this is a story that's repeated itself 1,000 times over across the federal
Mhm.
government. They don't want to lose some of the top talent that they
Mhm.
hired during the pandemic, and so all of a sudden, we discovered that we can pull from a better talent pool, and people can stay
Mhm.
closer to their communities, and sometimes it's not just a frivolous choice. Sometimes it means caring for a sick or dying parent. Sometimes it means maintaining family and
Sure.
cultural relationships in a place where you might not find that in Ottawa. For a lot of Indigenous people, staying close to their traditional territories, or at least a place with a lot
Mhm.
of cultural services that speak to their specific community. So I think there was kind of like this multifaceted experience of
Mhm.
telework and the benefits of it. There was no measurable decline in productivity, or at least we certainly have not seen that
Mhm.
presented to us in anything close to a compelling way by the employer. And it's only, and just to bridge over into talking about the lawsuit now,
Well, before
that
we talk about that, I
sure.
am curious about what they do tell you. So I've seen some of the claims by government officials about why, but
Mhm.
what are they actually telling you in conversations when you have these negotiations, when you have meetings with them? What are they actually telling you, and why are they asking to come to the office, even though they don't have data demonstrating a loss of
Mhm.
productivity?
I mean, you're the same things that you heard Christiane Fox. I don't know if you heard that interview on Power and Politics recently on kind of like national media in Canada, but Christiane Fox, who's kind of become the face of the employer on this, of explaining
Mm,
why this is a necessary measure to take, a necessary policy to implement, that we return to the office more days per week. Um, a lot of what she was saying was based on she felt, she
mm,
thought, not she could prove or she could demonstrate with anything close to
mm,
evidence, but she felt and she thought. And so, just to give you the experience of what we had learned during consultations, almost none of which happened before the policy was just announced that we were going back to the office more hours per day. And that's the basis for like our unfair labor practices or policy grievances, was just like there's a mandate. It's a statutory requirement that the employer consult the unions if there's going to be a major
mm,
change to working conditions, and that did not happen here. But more than that, yeah, we saw in meetings with the Treasury Board that there was just kind of like a general consensus, as they said, and they couldn't
mm,
prove any literature review. They weren't pointing to specific studies. They certainly couldn't
mm.
show their own data. In fact, their own data, as in like Statistics Canada data on productivity, shows that productivity went up
Yeah.
during the pandemic, and then with remote work options available to remote workers. So no, we've received nothing in the form of a satisfactory explanation. Part of the way this went down too was that it was leaked to the media that they were about
Mm,
to roll out a 3-day in office mandate as opposed to a 2-day in
yeah.
office mandate in September, and that happened in April of this year. But that was leaked
Mm.
from a whistleblower at Treasury Board that this was going to happen, but they
Ah.
had not prepared us anything close to the statutory timeline for
Mm,
consultations if they were going to roll the policy out anyway. But we found out in a very kind of like hostile way,
mm.
and the kind of tone of conversations with the Treasury Board after that were fairly hostile too. And like eventually,
I
all of
can
us pulled
imagine.
out, all of the major unions pulled out of consultations on the directive on telework after that because we saw this as an entirely bad faith exercise, and there was no
Mm,
desire to have a real conversation about this, and it seemed like decisions had already been made. So that's the
mm,
basis of a lot of our kind of joint policy grievances, unfair labor
mm.
practices. But to speak specifically to the lawsuit, though,
Yeah.
that was PSAC. I just want to clarify that that wasn't CAPE, my union.
Mm,
That was PSAC's judicial review that they were able to get through, and the judge determined that it had merit. But now, and more than anything, this is just going to force the employer to actually explain themselves.
good.
All that explanation that didn't happen before now is mandatory, and so
Mm,
we see the president of the Treasury Board. Well, she just got shuffled today, but will also continue in her role. But Anita Anand saying, as of last week, that they will be launching productivity studies, to
good.
which we say, why weren't these done before the policy
Yeah.
decision was taken? If you're doing evidence-based decision making and not what they call decision-based evidence making,
Mm,
then you would have launched these productivity studies before, and they know how to launch these studies. They know how
mm,
to, they have metrics, they have the capacity to do that, of course, being one of the largest organizations in the country that does this for other segments of the labor market and can certainly do it
mm,
for its own workforce. So we're going to see, I think, a lot of like, after the fact justifications, a lot of
mm,
a very questionable science, let's say, in terms of trying to
mm.
make the facts support the point
Yeah.
more than the other way around. So um, we understand this is about power. We can't speak specifically to why Treasury Board decided to make this decision. We know that some departments are losing people based on the fact that other departments had better telework arrangements, had better
Sure.
remote work policies, more days per week at home.
Mhm,
So some departments that had more restrictive in-office policies or more demanding in-office policies were losing people to those that didn't.
mm,
So that we know that that was a very real pressure in between departments because people can, as long as they're in the same classification or even if they apply for a completely
mhm,
new job, they can move around between departments, and most civil servants do. Um, but on top of that as well, yeah, there's just a sense that like this relationship is being bound a little bit more to more vulgar interests like commercial
mm.
landlords and like their relationship to the
Sure.
governing
Yep.
party. And I can't prove that directly, but people are really kind of scratching their heads right now trying to figure out what the driving force is behind how
Mm,
much they've dug their heels in. Like they know very
mhm,
well from their own employment surveys of their own workforce. This is everybody in the public service employment survey, well, the last one that they did, they're about to launch a new one, very clearly showed that like 90% of civil servants preferred to not work from a Government of Canada location, or at least have the
yeah.
flexibility to choose not to. Plus, like any survey of our members, which are like fairly wide sample size
Mhm.
in each of the three big unions that launched them. So PSAC, PIPS, and CAPE all showed similar numbers, 80 to 90% of workers saying they would like flexible remote work rights and they would like the option at least to work from home, if not an outright work from home policy. So I think like they knew that that was the case in their workforce, and
Mhm.
I think that people are really trying to like. Of course, the conspiracies are starting to flow right now in terms of
Sure.
who they serve, who the interests are that they're trying to back with this, what the demand is for this forced return to office when a lot of other jurisdictions around the world and even around the country are kind of like moving towards a remote work rights regime because it makes fiscal sense,
Mhm.
because it makes environmental sense, because it eases gridlock. You know, I
Oh,
could prattle on
so on
about
this
the
topic,
benefits of remote work.
yeah, on
Yeah.
this topic, I'm curious to ask specifically about the difference between the federal and the state governments. Now, in my own
Mm,
experience, I did trainings and consulting for the government of Northwest Territories and the government of Nova Scotia on helping them do effective hybrid and remote work arrangements, and then
hmm
did training for their leadership teams on how to do effective hybrid work and remote work. And what I notice is that the government agencies that tend to bring me in, they actually want to do effective hybrid work and remote work, and that's why they bring in someone to train them on how to do so.
I
And
see.
I'm curious whether there was any training done for the managers at the Treasury. So helping them manage their teams more effectively. Because a problem, of course, is if managers don't know how to manage hybrid workers and remote workers effectively, then they will say, well, I don't know how to manage people
hmm
ineffectively when they're working remotely. I want them back in the office. So that's kind of a natural intuition. So that's something that I was working with the government of Nova Scotia and the government of Northwest Territories to address. And so I'm curious whether there was any training done. Like that's pretty good. If there was no training done, that's pretty good evidence that there was no good faith effort to actually make hybrid work effective.
Sure. And as far as I know, no, there has not been any done. Maybe they
Mm,
could contradict me with modules or anything that had been unrolled during kind of like the peak pandemic at peak remote work. I can just speak to our own members, who
yeah.
some of whom are like lower level managers, and I can say that no, they have not received any specific training
Hmm.
because we think that the general direction is to try to roll back to 5 days a week in the office. And I know that
Hmm.
like some state governments, for example, like I think one of the provincial or state governments in Australia, despite the federal government having a full flexible remote work rights policy regime in place at the federal level for the public service in Australia, there's state governments that are now forcing 5 days in office.
Hmm.
No, but as far as I know, there was no training given to managers, at least at the lower levels, that would have been directly working with teams.
Hmm.
I can't speak necessarily to senior management cadres. I don't have access to their training modules, of course, but just speaking to our own members, a lot of whom are kind of like managers and directors in the federal public service, so lower level management cadres. No, they did not receive any training specifically to this. And of course, like the pivot to hybrid happened in such a kind of sudden kind of violent way because of the the suddenness of the pandemic, and it was a
Yeah.
very, and like I don't fault the Public Service Commission or Treasury Board for some of the roughshod adjustments that they had to do on
Sure.
very quick turnaround time while the country was going through a medical crisis, an economic crisis, a number of intertwined crises
Hmm.
that the lockdowns from COVID-19 brought on. But at the same time, people pivoted and they pivoted fast. And I'd say within about 6 months, and this is once again anecdotal, and I wish that they had been doing productivity studies, and I wish that they'd been doing labor relations work on studying and like good faith studying the impacts of
Hmm.
remote work as such at the workforce level when they had the opportunity to do that when more people were working remotely as a full-time experience, but they didn't do that to my knowledge. And now they don't have baseline data to compare the experience of
Hmm.
full-time remote work, which I don't think necessarily anybody's asking for only
Yeah.
remote work. I think some workers would like to come into an office, some workers would like to collaborate occasionally in shared office space, but the idea of
Hmm.
flexible remote work rights like they have in Australia, where a manager has to
Hmm.
default to remote work when it's requested unless they can prove with a fairly high standard of evidence that it's operationally necessary for
Hmm.
somebody to be in office. I think that's more what we're leaning towards once we get into bargaining and
Yeah.
the language that Australia was able to win in their collective agreements. We would like to see that reproduced here. But I
And
would say that
that's
there's a huge
it's not
gap
only
though in terms.
Australia. We're also looking UK. We're also seeing
Yes,
UK move to that, which is
yes,
exciting.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think like this is a major turning point in kind of like workforce futures in terms of labor
Mhm.
relations, in terms of industrial policy, in a lot of cases, in terms of the real estate market, in terms of what urban space looks like. Like there's a lot of things that this opens up. It's of course not a panacea. It's a very
Sure.
concrete and specific issue in a lot of ways too, but there's a lot of intertwining um, forces that can be unleashed from this, or like problems that can be attenuated from
Mhm.
this, or at least we think so. And we think that we'd like to experiment with some new models here. And like, we're not asking for something that doesn't exist in the world, like you're saying. We're asking for normalization of a work model that was frankly tried and tested and worked out fairly
Mhm.
well in terms of there was no huge productivity crises that anybody can point to in any federal Canadian department during the pandemic
Absolutely.
when we were full-time remote working. In fact, it worked out quite well, and a lot of the mental health impacts and the isolation
Mhm.
impacts and whatnot, those do need to be studied. Those do need to be taken seriously, and we do need to kind of like figure out new social spaces, new ways for teams to build culture,
Mhm.
new ways for like managers, like you're saying, to be trained on how to effectively support their teams in a remote way. But I would say that we have not seen a good faith study of this because they were so predetermined to return back to a more in-office policy at the same time that
Mhm.
they have contradictory, and by they I mean our employer, has contradictory policy goals of converting half of the federal office footprint to
Yeah.
housing, which you can't hold those two things at the same time. Those are already starting to clash, and we're already seeing departments saying, well, there's no way we're going to 3 days. We simply don't have the space. So I
Now,
think they're already in
when
a
you
material crisis. I'll just finish my
Mhm.
point. They're
Sure,
already
sure.
in a material crisis here in the sense that they
Mhm.
just simply do not have enough space. And I think the political demands will start to stack up over and over again. And I think
Mhm.
with unions running joint campaigns and with potentially provincial and municipal public sector unions joining
Yeah.
this fight because they see all the stakes that are involved in it, it's not just about work model, it's about what to do with urban space as well and what to do with the public purse in
Mm.
terms of resources that we're spending and what we're spending them on, whether this is a good use of billions of dollars for
Mm.
office related costs. So that's I think going to be a political question that somebody's going to have to answer at some point with
Mhm.
consequences potentially for them.
That
Sorry, you were
makes a lot
saying
of
though?
sense. Yeah, I was saying, so when you're talking about kind of the office versus kind of the union versus the employer negotiation, one element that you talk, I think, is definitely going to be good is to push for training of managers. But I'm curious,
Mhm.
is there are there efforts to get actual external experts involved in the discussions to, because there's a lot of external research on what are
Mhm.
actual best practices, a lot of findings on
Yeah.
the benefits of hybrid working, or is it just kind of the one side versus the other side rather than, and no reference to external evidence? Because while
Mhm.
studies were not done previously, which they should have been done, there's a lot of
Mhm.
external evidence available
There is.
that we can use to refer to and figure out, okay, what are actual best practices? What are the dynamics that will work best? I'm curious about that.
Absolutely. So, like, one of the things that we're doing is the four big unions, so PSAC, PIPS, CAPE, and the Association of Canadian Financial Officers are partnering now on a joint digital campaign.
Mhm.
The initial stage of which will be mostly like literature reviews, some field testing, some focus groups, things like that. But a lot of that is going to be to assemble the evidence base, and the evidence base is kind of
Mhm.
scattered, and it can be quite serving of a particular, predetermined direction, and that's why we have to be very careful about what standard of evidence we're using here. But like we could cherry pick a lot of studies that support our point. We'd like to look at the field of evidence as it exists
Mhm.
now, integrate some experts into that initial kind of campaign development. We cite studies. We could pull a lot from our pockets right now that we'd like to say show that productivity is not impacted or that it improves. I think,
Mhm.
interests that would say they want to force more of an in-office presence might point to other studies that kind of like make the point. And I'm not saying that that's science is, relativist here. I'm saying there are some baseline studies here that have some longitudinal data now built into them
Mhm.
that I think we need to look at very closely and assemble that evidence base. But I think part of like where we're coming from is like, yes, we'd like to look at those things, but we'd also like to look at the desires and the will of our membership here. And they've
Of
been
course.
overwhelmingly clear that 90% of them say they feel like their work-life balance, they feel like their lives, they feel like
Mhm.
their work lives were positively impacted and improved by the
Mhm.
experience of remote work. And if we need to have a conversation on how much office space to maintain, Whether we want hybrid, what that means, how many days per week, let's have that conversation. But simply like
Mhm.
imposing more days per week after failing to have the consultation that was promised after bargaining in the last, rounds of bargaining with the major
Yeah.
unions is why we have such a hostile relationship right now to this employer on this issue. And I think that they are really scrambling to try and explain themselves. And the more that they
Mhm.
get in front of the media and say we feel and we think things instead of we know, shows how little that they've anticipated, I think, this level of pushback and how little they paid attention to this as a problem that they would
Mhm.
actually have to answer for. But now this judicial review should at least initiate that process, and we're excited to see what they
Mhm.
try to put together in a scramble to prove
Mhm.
their point. And of course, PSAC is going to work closely with its partners, us, PIPs, to
Mhm.
put together some of that evidence base, but that'll be part of our larger campaign strategy.
Okay. I'll be happy to send you a copy of my book on this topic, Leading
I'd love
Hybrid and
that.
Remote Teams. Yeah, and I think there could be, I'm happy to also provide some resources. I know folks
Hmm.
who I've done some research myself. I know other folks have done a lot of research on these topics that I think would be quite relevant for
I would
you.
love to. Would love to see what you
Yeah.
put together.
Sure. And this is something that's really important. When you're talking about, we have external evidence, but what you're talking about with your union members, that's internal evidence, and very
Hmm.
much aligns with external evidence in terms of showing very clearly that hybrid work improves retention, improves well-being, the
Yep.
flexibility improves retention, improves well-being, improves work-life balance for the large majority of people, and does have some negative effects in isolation.
Yeah.
So we can certainly talk about that. But those
Absolutely.
are going to be important things. Now, judicial review, how much external evidence versus internal, like what will that actually involve? What will the judicial review actually involve looking at?
The judicial review is going to have to, just within policy development federally, there has to be some evidence base for the development of a policy. Otherwise, it
Hmm.
can be subject to review. And this is also, entangled within our union rights as well to be properly consulted on major changes to the workplace. So I think like more than just kind of like, a stunt that's going to make them actually have to speak publicly about where they're coming from on
Hmm.
on this policy. This actually is a really great exercise too to say we need to put our cards on the table and show the evidence threshold that we're able to meet by assembling the data. And like the data that we're going to present, of course, and by we, I'm not speaking about Cape. Cape is not the one who's the direct, who's a directly named party. Of
Hmm.
course, we're interested in this because we're working very closely with PSAC on this campaign. But yeah, you have to speak to PSAC very directly about the types of evidence that they're going to present versus the types of evidence that they are anticipating. But
Hmm.
the evidence threshold is kind of built into the review process as such. There's not some penalty, I don't believe, for the employer, but there are legal steps potentially after
Hmm.
if a judge isn't convinced that the proper steps were taken under public scrutiny to be able to justify a policy, which for our union, for CAPE as policy analysts, every day that's what we do. We have
Hmm.
incredibly rigorous, in fact, policy kind of checklists that we have to go through, processes that we have to follow, justifications that we have to
Hmm.
provide. We have to show our work. We can't just throw numbers around um, to satisfy the party of the day or to kind of like support an initiative for political gain. And of course, like that can be a challenging element of being a policy analyst is that sometimes you're asked to do things that you're like, I don't know if we'll be able to provide the evidence base for this. So I
Sure.
really feel for those Treasury Board analysts and like others who
Hmm.
might feel like they're trying to, stick a round peg into a square hole, to use
Hmm.
that old saying, in terms of the evidence base. But I am actually quite sincerely interested, not just as
Hmm.
somebody who's politically invested in this, but as somebody who cares about this issue quite a bit and thinks that it could potentially free up billions of dollars of resources, that it could potentially take, hundreds of thousands of commuters off our roads. Like we can see the potential
Hmm.
social impacts of this, but in terms of the workplace and work-life balance and mental health and things like that, I'm actually very interested to see where they come from because I think this is going to have to be part of the conversation that we eventually have with Treasury Board on this is like, what do we
Hmm.
actually want this policy to mean? Not just a hybrid
Hmm.
policy, not just a mandatory in-office policy, but what do we want the future of work to be? And so I think that this judicial review, even though it came out of such a hostile experience, is actually going to have a lot of cards put on the table, and then we'll
Hmm.
be able to have a much more adult conversation about what is good policy, what is a good use of taxpayer dollars, and what makes sense for our country, right? And this is also the biggest
Yeah.
employer in the country too, so this will set a benchmark at least at that stage. Like there will
Sure.
never have been as intensive of a putting of the cards on the table, so to
Hmm.
speak, On this issue. I don't think that's happened yet at that level yet, where the biggest employer and one of the biggest unions in the country has had to put an evidence base together to show their position on a workplace issue. So this is a really exciting time, and I'm really excited to see what comes out of that. But in the meantime, we'll be kind of like escalating, like we said, in the workplace to force the abandonment of mandatory in-office days. We think that that is a ham-fisted policy, regardless of which way the evidence shakes down. But we'd like to get back to the drawing board and like negotiate this before we get into bargaining and strike territory and things like that, because workers are very, very upset about this.
Sure.
They've been patronized. They've been like told that they don't need to be explained why things are changing in their workplace, even though they had a very positive experience that improved their lives very recently, and they can't understand why that's being taken away for them just to sit in traffic, just to have to commute again, just to do remote work from the office too. Like a lot of our members are finding that they're just doing remote work at the office also. So,
Sure.
and also the whole element of going back to worse workplaces than the ones we left behind, because in office collaboration is so important, but we're going to make it one of the least productive workplaces that you've ever worked in the federal government. There's just a lot of kind of um, juggling of various positions from the employer while they try to put on a smile and try to explain to us that they're doing this for our own good. That I think a lot of members here, as you know, fairly well-educated, serious people that are expected to produce evidence-based decisions every day. This is just not going to stand for our members, and I don't think it should stand for any Canadian federal public servant.
Okay. Well, that's very helpful. Thank you. I appreciate you
Mhm.
explaining this. This is great.
I appreciate the